All right, welcome to Module 10, the Late Roman Empire, and we're going to talk about early Christianity in this lesson. Christianity in the first century was oftentimes spread by very ordinary people, and there was one particular individual that did a lot to help shape the theology of Christianity and spread the gospel message quite widely throughout the Roman Empire, and this was the Apostle Paul. So the Apostle Paul, when he was born, he went by the name of Saul. He came from a Romanized city of Tarsus. So Tarsus is kind of in the southern part of modern-day Turkey. We know that Paul, or Saul, as he went by initially, was a Roman citizen. So he enjoyed the rights of Roman citizens. Although he was not Roman by birth, he was one of these individuals whose families had been granted citizenship by the Roman Empire as it expanded. Well, Saul, as a Jewish individual, had come to Jerusalem, where he became a Pharisee, one of the teachers of the law. And so he was someone who, for the first part of his life, was committed to going after the followers of Jesus and bringing them before the Jewish courts to be charged with blasphemy, because the courts were saying that the followers of Jesus were saying that Jesus had risen from the dead and that Jesus was God. And in fact, we first encounter Saul in the biblical text in the book of Acts, where he is attending the trial of a follower of Jesus named Stephen. And in fact, at the trial, when Stephen, says that Jesus is God, this causes a riot in the Jewish court. And the judge drags Stephen out and they start stoning him to death. And we read in the book of Acts that Paul, or Saul, as he was known at the time, was standing there holding the coats of people who were throwing the stones, and that he was approving of Stephen's death. And that, in fact, this kind of episode, the next time we read about Saul in the book of Acts, he's on his way to the city of Damascus, where he has learned a group of Jesus' followers are living. And so he's on his way to arrest them so that he can bring them back to Jerusalem to stand trial before the Jewish courts. However, we read in the book of Acts that on his way to Damascus, Saul has an encounter with God. He sees a bright light, and he sees Jesus and hears him saying, "Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And it's at this moment that Saul realizes that everything that Stephen and the other followers of Jesus had said was true, that Jesus really was the Son of God. And so Saul has this conversion experience, and he goes from persecuting Christians to becoming one of them himself and spreading the gospel message. As kind of a sign of his conversion, we sort of seeing him change his name from Saul to Paul, and that name change kind of represents his dramatic conversion. Now, for those of you that grew up in the church here at Menard, we talk about biblical text. I'm sure you've heard this story before. So for us, it's kind of, ho-hum. It's quite radical at the time, however. I kind of explain it like the modern day terms like this. So, it's kind of equivalent to, you all heard of ISIS, the different leaders of ISIS want to kill all the Americans. It would be like if you had a leader of ISIS suddenly coming to the United States and being like, "Oh, I've actually had a total change of heart, and I don't want to kill Americans anymore. In fact, I want to apply for American citizenship." It's not that kind of radical, it's that kind of radical sort of change. And so, not surprisingly, when Paul does show up in Jerusalem to say, "Hey guys, guess what? I'm not here to persecute you. I'm a Christian." It takes a while for the Christian community to kind of warm up to Paul. They're first a little nervous, trying that he's maybe trying to infiltrate and so that he can arrest them. But over time, they realize that yes, indeed, he does have this dramatic conversion, and that this has actually taken place. The Apostle Paul is very significant to the spread of Christianity because he will go on several missionary journeys to spread the gospel message, and you can kind of see on this map the different lines that kind of point out these different journeys that he took, and he has a basic plan. Every time he would go to one of these journeys, he would visit the town, like maybe you'd say that Thessalonica, and that's the first place he would go is the local Jewish synagogue, and he would start to preach about Jesus in the synagogue. And if the Jews were not interested in learning about Jesus and kind of kicked him out, he would then start preaching to the non-Jewish people or the Gentiles. So he would start preaching to them, and what we start to see is, people on Paul's missionary journeys, oftentimes, he had more impact among the Gentile population than the Jewish population. And so Paul becomes a very important figure because his mission is not to spread the message of Jesus amongst the Jews in the Roman Empire only, but that he's also preaching the message to the non-Jewish individuals. Hence, this is where, we start to see the gospel message really spreading even more widely. The Apostle Paul is also instrumental in helping to formulate basic Christian theology or beliefs about God that Christians believe today. So if you read the works of Paul, he's quite good at explaining, the basic theological beliefs. So what are they? Well, one of the very important theological beliefs is that one that we've mentioned before, that Jesus was fully God and fully man. And this is an important theological belief because without this idea, salvation doesn't really work. So if you think about it, when Adam and Eve kind of committed the very first sin by rebelling against God, they were the ones who, that God said mankind has rebelled and that they're trying to become God. And so this kind of caused a separation between God and man. And in order to heal this separation with humanity, because what they had stolen from God belonged to God, humanity needs to pay back and repay God for that sin. But the problem is mankind owed the debt, but mankind couldn't pay the debt because mankind owes everything. So God owns everything, including mankind. So mankind doesn't have anything of his own that he could actually use to repay the debt. God, of course, owns everything. So it's God who has the ability to, kind of pay the debt back. God has no need to pay the debt because he's God. He's not the one who has the debt in the first place. So we're kind of left with this problem. We have man who owes but can't pay, and we have a God who can pay but doesn't owe. And so this is why we have Jesus becoming fully God and fully man. As God, he can pay back the debt as man. He can pay back the debt if that makes sense at all. So we're pulling these two ideas together and saying Jesus is fully God, has the ability to pay back the debt, and fully man who can submit the payment for the debt on behalf of the rest of mankind. So this is why salvation works, and this is the reason for the incarnation. And Paul, of course, makes it very clear in his writings to the first century church that Jesus is fully God and fully man. And of course, because of this, as we just said, we are justified by faith in Jesus Christ. Now, don't get confused by all these fancy theological language. Justification simply means you are made righteous or acceptable to God. It's a little phrase that we learned growing up in church, that we are justified by faith. And this means that it's like we never sin. So the idea of being made righteous is that you are without fault, you are without sin. Well, we can have that status before God when we have faith in Christ. And so this message is a free message. Jesus has come. He's the Messiah to free us from sin. He also frees us from death. And so this is a beautiful message that Paul is preaching. And of course, this means that we're saved by grace, that basically there's nothing that we can do to earn it. The justification comes by faith. It doesn't come by us doing grace or doing works only by themselves. It comes as grace, which means a gift. And so what really Paul is saying is your ability to be reconciled with God is a gift from God himself. And he says this to the church in Ephesus when he writes, "For it is by grace you are saved through faith, and it is not from yourselves." In other words, you can't do a darn thing to earn this at all. It's a gift from God. And so this is really a free message, and the whole thing, the gospel story is not only are we getting, the gift that we don't deserve, but it comes from Jesus, and we can't mess it up because all we have to do is accept it through faith. And this is why it's exciting to be a Christian. Now, Paul also writes about the fact that for those who do accept this gift, it's not like we didn't just sit on our butts and do nothing. Certainly, it doesn't mean that we can continue a lifestyle that sort of just says, hey, we can just keep stealing or whatever. We can't just go kill anybody or anything like that because we're saved. Paul notes that someone who accepts this gift from God is going to want God to be pleased with them. And so this is the idea of sanctification, or the process of being made holy. So that really is a process that takes the rest of a Christian's life. It's a process of becoming more holy, of patterning your life after that of Jesus Christ. And so, we are saved by grace, but the Holy Spirit works within us to sanctify us and make us holy. We also see in Paul's theology that he talks about two sacraments or two ceremonies. If you like the catchphrase for sacraments, theology, I'm not a theology professor, but he said the sacraments are visible signs of invisible grace. So in other words, these are ceremonies and rituals that we do to remind ourselves of these theological principles. And there are two that he mentions in particular. He talks about the stresses these in the New Testament. One are the ceremony of baptism, which is kind of a welcoming ceremony into the Christian faith. The idea of baptism represents that your old life of sin is gone and done with and over, and that you're entering new life of faith. And the other is the Eucharist, and it also goes by the name of communion or the Lord's Supper, depending on which Christian tradition you're a part of. And this is the ceremony by which Christians remember Jesus' death and his resurrection and his sacrifice for them. It usually involves drinking some sort of wine or grape juice product, depending on your tradition, and eating a sort of bread product, either a cracker or a wafer or something along those lines. And it represents the blood and body of Jesus that was shed on the cross so that we could be reconciled with God. So that's the kind of gospel message and the theology that Apostle Paul really details out in his letters. And so this is the other reason why he's such a significant figure into early Christianity. So far in this lesson, we've been looking at Christianity from the insider's point of view, how Christians talk about their faith. But this raises a historical question, which is, how did the Romans view Christianity? And that's actually quite complex kind of thing to kind of talk about, But you have to keep in mind that the Roman people, that were made up a lot of different individuals. So each individual would have their own unique perspective on Christianity. That being said, we could kind of establish some generalizations of particular views that we know at least certain Roman people had of Christianity in the first century. And so that's really what we're going to look at now. Now, we should start off by simply noting that, in general, Romans are very tolerant of other religions. This tends to be the characteristic of a lot of people who are polytheistic because they worship many gods. They tend to be very tolerant of other religions because they already kind of come from the perspective that there's lots of other gods. So if you're, if you're worshiping another god, they're just like, okay, you're worshiping, one of the many gods that exist. And so we do know that the Romans were very tolerant of other religions. They were only two things you couldn't do. So the only way that the religion could become totally unacceptable to the Romans would be if you were practicing human sacrifice. That's a big no-no for the Romans. And secondly, if you're using the religion to plot the overthrow of the Roman state. And so that was the big thing, provided you avoid treason and avoid human sacrifice. The Romans pretty much leave you alone. And certainly when Christianity begins, in the immediate aftermath of Jesus' death and resurrections, the Romans don't do anything about it. They kind of view Christianity as a weird form of Judaism, and they leave it alone initially. The problem is when the Jews start going after the Christians, like the Apostle Paul we mentioned, he's stoning Stephen. It's kind of the disorder that draws the attention of the Romans, and they start to investigate, and it's at this point in time that the Jewish leaders go to the Romans and basically convince a lot of Roman authorities that Christianity is a new religion. Now, I said that the Romans are generally tolerant, but we should say this: they are suspicious of new religions. So this kind of goes back to the ancient mindset that's very different from our modern one. In the ancient world, new things are generally treated with suspicion. New things that are old and, so you want things that are old and traditional and established. So when the Romans thought that Christianity was really a part of Judaism, which is an old established religion, they were basically leaving it alone. But the Romans are convinced that Christians are new. Now suddenly the Roman government is much more suspicious. They tend to view Christianity as much more dangerous. We also find that there are many Romans who have misunderstandings about Christianity, and we can kind of understand these, how they come to be. Imagine you're in the marketplace, and we say in the marketplace, we just, imagine that I invite you to my house, and I would, come out and for a love feast. And at this love feast, we're going to be loving on our brothers and sisters. We're going to be drinking blood, and we're going to be eating flesh, and we're going to, love each other. My guess is many of you would run in horror to, Coach Gatlin or the administration or Father Bill to say, you have to get rid of Coach Redmond because, he's invited us to a vampiric cannibalistic orgy or something like that. Now, I'm saying this, you've misunderstood what I'm inviting you to my house to do, right? I'm inviting you for communion, which is, by the way, I'm not actually, doing that, but you can kind of see the misunderstandings that come. If you're hearing people talk about drinking blood and they're talking about eating flesh and you're not a Christian, you might think, oh my goodness, these people are monsters. And so certainly there seems to be some misunderstandings from the Romans, on the part of the Romans, about what the Christians are up to. And there's a lot of class prejudice that certain Romans have against Christians. We know that Christianity spread very, very quickly among the lower classes. And this is probably because Christianity offers a message of equality, of spiritual equality, and we know that early Christians are heavily involved in caring for the needs of other Christians in their communities. There really isn't welfare in the first century, and so if someone who's from a lower class, when you see these people are taking care of each other's needs, it might attract you to find out what is this group of Christians, what are they up to, and maybe even become a Christian yourself. And you recognize you're in a way joining an extended family of believers when you become a Christian. We also know that a lot of women become Christians, and again, I think that's the principle of spiritual equality that is attracting women, because even amongst Roman society, women may be able to mix with men, but they certainly are considered less than men. And so because of that, I think Romans have a bit of prejudice against Christians. They're like, well, that's a religion for slaves, and that's a religion for women, class, prejudice and gender prejudice, but they kind of put Christianity down because of that. Now, it's not to say there aren't wealthy and influential people who become Christians, because there are, but there are just aren't as many of those people. Romans see Christianity as being very irrational in their minds. Christians are worshiping someone who was executed as a criminal. So remember, Jesus was executed on a cross, so to them it's very irrational. Why are you worshiping this person? And in fact, we actually have some evidence. This is an image on this slide, and it's kind of difficult to see, and so I found where somebody had kind of drawn out the stone image so you can see it better. But we have here a figure. If you were able to read Latin, they say it's Alexi Manos, and the graffito reads, Aleximanos worships God, so this is Aleximanos and this is his God, and notice that his God is on the cross. And so, you get a sense that like he's worshiping this God, and then they notice how they put the head of a donkey on Christ there, and they're kind of making fun of Christianity here, and you get the sense that they're saying, why would you worship this? Because, why would you become a Christian? But probably the biggest challenge for Christians is that the Christians don't practice the imperial cult. So when Vespasian becomes the emperor and really starts to stress people practice it, it opens Christianity to charges of treason. And so this is the view that is going to lead the Roman government investigating Christians and occasionally putting them to death. The earliest examples that we have of Christians being persecuted do not come from the Romans, but rather from the conflicts that Christians get into with the Jews. Remember, we talked about earlier Stephen, who was the first Christian martyr, being executed by the Jewish judges after Stephen said that Jesus was the Son of God. But over time, it's not just simply the Jews who will be killing Christians in acts of mob violence, but rather we see at times the Roman government itself executing Christians. There is these periods of persecution ad hoc, which means that, it's not happening all the time. Instead, what we tend to see is that persecution tends to come in times of crisis. So when the Roman government is faced with crisis, they're looking for scapegoats, people they can blame things on, and Christians become a convenient target. So remember, as we mentioned, there is that great fire that breaks out in Rome during the reign of Nero. That's a crisis point. So what does Nero do? He says, the Christians started it, because they wanted to overthrow the government. Let's round them up and kill them. And, in our next lesson, we're going to talk about the decline of the Roman Empire. And so in the 2nd century, we have 5 good emperors in the 2nd century, and life's pretty good. And then we move to the 3rd century. Rome gets back into this period of crisis. And so we see increased persecutions of Christians at that time. But we also have accounts of times where, Romans aren't interested in going after Christians. In fact, I once read an account about a group of Christians in Syria where they basically walked up to the governor and his house, knock on his door, and were like, "Hi, we're Christians. We're here so that you can kill us and become martyrs of our faith." And the people are willing to die for their faith. And the Roman governor basically says, "I'm busy, go home, I don't want to deal with you." He sends them on their way. So, certainly not every, the Roman is trying to persecute the Christians. It's not like Hitler going after the Jews in World War II. And the other thing we can say about the persecution of Christians by the Romans is that Romans do follow a set of procedures in investigating and dealing with Christians. So oftentimes, the procedure is if a person is denounced to the Roman authorities as a Christian and the Roman official wants to deal with it, again, not all the time, but if they did want to deal with it, they would arrest the individual and question them. So you would say, like, "Are you a Christian?" If the person says yes, then frequently what they would do is send them back to prison. They might, beat them or something, but they'd use this physical punishment and then give them time to think about the answer and bring them back for a second time. It's only after the person continues to say, "Yes, I am a Christian. Yes, I'm a Christian. Yes, I'm a Christian," that finally the Romans will kind of throw up their hands and say, "All right, then we're going to kill you." So this isn't an immediate kind of thing, like where you've been arrested and, executed the next day for the most part. The other thing is that if they ask you, "Are you a Christian?" and you say no, the Romans would let you practice the imperial cult. So, you would go before a Roman official, you'd make a sacrifice, pray to the Roman gods for the protection of the emperor. And then usually you would just say, make sure you don't associate with Christians again and send you on your way. So, you can really see from that kind of procedure, the Romans are not really interested in kind of, again, for the most part, just getting and wiping out the Christians wholesale. But if the Christian continued to be obstinate from the perspective of the Roman official and refuses to practice the imperial cult and denounce Christ, then the official will eventually say, "I have no choice but to send you off for execution." And of course, when Christians are executed, we call them martyrs because they're willing to die for their faith, and they would be executed in a variety of ways, often as part of public entertainment. Remember, a lot of people who are coming out of Christianity are members of lower class, so because of that, they're subject to public executions. Now, if you're a Roman citizen, your executions are generally less painful and less public. So this is why that we believe Paul's execution was probably an execution by beheading because Paul was a Roman citizen. However, other members of Jesus' apostles, like Peter, for instance, who was a Jewish man, did not have Roman citizenship. The tradition states that Peter was crucified upside down and actually requested to be crucified upside down because he said he wasn't worthy to be crucified in the same manner as Jesus had been. We also find other people who are executed will sometimes be executed by being torn apart by wild beasts in the arena, and you get this idea, Christians and lions in the arena. And you can certainly say that the martyrs, it doesn't end Christianity. It actually has the opposite effect. Because many times what happens is these martyrs die. They're stoic and they're not pleading or crying, and because they have faith in God. And this impresses the crowd and sometimes attracts people to Christianity because they say, wow, what is this person willing to die for? This Jesus. I want to find out more about this Jesus. And they kind of sounds like they're willing to die for him. Maybe there's something different there. And we see that Christianity continues to expand first and second and third centuries and, of course, beyond. So what have we really learned? Well, I think the big points, Christianity emphasizes the idea of spiritual equality and provides social services for its followers. The community takes care of each other's needs, and this would attract a lot of individuals to become followers of Jesus. But when Christians refuse to participate in the imperial cult, the Romans start to question their loyalties, accuse them of wanting to overthrow the government. And even though Christians say, look, we're praying to God for protection, and protection of the emperor, this doesn't really work in those times of crisis. So the Roman state starts looking for people to blame, and they blame Christians. The other thing that we see is Christianity would not become widely accepted until the emperor named Constantine. And it's estimated that at the reign of Constantine, only about 1 to 5% of the population of the Roman Empire was Christian. But when Constantine has his own encounter with Christian God himself and starts to lean towards Christianity, we start to see the shift, and Christianity would again gain acceptance during the reign of Constantine. So that's what we'll be talking about in our next lesson as we look at the Roman Empire transforms and also goes into a period of decline in the western part of the empire. So thanks for watching, and we will see you next lesson.